Farm Credit East is pleased to bring you this webinar today in conjunction with the program on dairy markets and policy. I know we have participants joining us from across the country, so for those of you who don't know Farm Credit East, we're a cooperative based in Enfield, Connecticut, part of the National Farm Credit System, providing $6.6 billion in loans and other financial services to our 14,000 members across 7 Northeast states. Dairy is our largest segment of our loan portfolio at over 20%. And this webinar is being brought to you by our Knowledge Exchange Group, where we offer content and business insights and information to help our members run their businesses, as well as educate other stakeholders. And you can check out other Knowledge Exchange content at farmcrediteast.com/knowledge exchange. So turning to the topic of today's webinar, in February, the bipartisan budget deal made some changes to the Dairy Margin Protection Program. Many dairy producers are currently facing financial challenges with the market conditions over the last few years. The Dairy Margin Protection Program was created in the 2014 Farm Bill and has not been widely used beyond the minimum coverage in the last couple of years. Today's webinar is going to show how we got there to where we are today. And the second part is really going to look forward at examining the changes that were made and discuss some of the tools that producers can use to determine whether or not it makes sense for them to participate now that the sign up for the new MPP program has been reopened. And to do that, we're pleased to be joined by 2 of the nation's leading dairy economists and the co-chairs of the program on dairy markets and policy. Dr. Mark Stevenson is the Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Mark is originally from Michigan with degrees from Michigan State and his PhD from Cornell, where he spent 19 years on the faculty. His academic work covers all aspects of dairy industry economics and policy. And Mark's been a frequent speaker on our webinars and in fact did our annual Dairy Outlook webinar in January. So we're pleased to welcome Mark back for this webinar. And we also have with us Dr. Andrew Novakovic, who is the E.D. Baker Professor of Agricultural Economics and also the Director of Land Grant Programs at Cornell University, where he served in many roles, including as a past department chair. A native of Wisconsin, he has degrees from the University of Wisconsin River Falls and a master's and PhD from Purdue University. And he has also spent his academic career studying the economics and policy of the dairy sector. And in addition to his outstanding research in this area, he's also a talented instructor on the subject, which I can attest to as a former student of his. He's also been on Farm Credit East webinars and a contributor to our publication, so it's great to have Andy with us today as well. And before I turn it over to Andy and Mark for their presentation, I'm going to give our participants a minute to review the legal disclaimer. I just want to thank both Andy and Mark and the program on dairy markets and policy for teaming up with Farm Credit East today to present this webinar. Just as a reminder for our participants, after Andy and Mark's presentation, we are going to leave some time for questions. As Heather mentioned, but for those of you who may have just joined us in the last few minutes, you go to the GoToWebinar control panel and click on the orange arrow. You can type in your questions. In addition, a PDF of the slides is also included as an attachment on the control panel. And so with that, I'm going to ask Heather to hand the controls over to Andy and Mark, and we look forward to their presentation.
All right, this is Andy Novakovic, and I'm pleased to be able to speak with you. We're going to do this in 2 parts, and as Tom mentioned, I'm going to do a little bit of teeing up the ball for Mark, who's going to focus more exclusively on what I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek calling MPP Dairy 2.0. When it comes right down to it, I think the decision that producers faced with respect to this new program is fairly straightforward. But as we've been speaking to producers and other interested parties because of the launch of 2.0, we're sort of discovering that it opens up the door to a lot of conversations about, why isn't it this way or that way, and how come it doesn't help me with this, and other things that go beyond just simply the mechanics of the revised program. And so I thought I would spend just a little bit of time kind of going back and just saying, let's remember what we're trying to do and sort of who's doing what. And depending on the part of the country you're in, I think everybody would agree this is a fairly turbulent time, and some parts of the country have a little different spin on what it is that is making their region particularly having certain issues about marketing, plant availability, premium structures, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and maybe a punchline is MPV Dairy, even the 2.0 version, can only do so much. I like to begin talking about who's doing what and what can they do by reminding folks that in some ways, the first dairy policy was actually allowing farmers to legally come together and cooperate on the marketing of their milk. Dairy cooperatives are an important part of the marketing system for the dairy industry, representing 80–85% of all the milk marketed. And I think many would agree that they play a particularly valuable role, but there's only so much that a private firm can do or a cooperative can do. And what we're learning is that a lot of what co-ops do is about pricing and selling and basic market logistics. But probably the biggest thing that many are being reminded now is they guarantee a market. If you're a member of a cooperative, they guarantee they'll find a place to put your milk. They can't guarantee a return. They can't guarantee that you'll be happy with the price. And sometimes I suppose that's a disappointment. But one thing that people certainly in my part of the country have come to appreciate is at least you've got a place to go with your milk. The first step in direct market regulation was the creation of the Federal Milk Marketing Order System in the 30s. And oh, by the way, there are a few states that have that authority as well. One of them, the big one, California, is right now in the process of deciding whether or not to stick with the state system or moving to the federal version. But classified pricing and pooling is another one of these things that accomplishes a lot, but only does so much. We could spend a lot of time talking about federal orders. That's not today's topic, but I'm just going to say at a high level, a primary contribution of classified pricing and pooling is to make the rules of pricing fairly transparent. That doesn't always mean they're real easy to understand, but they're written down. It's transparent in the sense of you can figure out what the rules are. They try to be fair, which means every farmer is operating under the same rules. Every processor is operating under the same rules, and of course applying those rules evenly across the market. Neither one of these systems can fix the price of milk, as in make it the way you want it to be. And therein gets us into some of the next things that we've tried. Probably the best example, and in some ways the most successful example of fixing, and not as in establishing, but making it right, better, fixing the price of milk was the old milk price support program. Which was in its heyday from about the 1940s until I'm going to say about the 1990s. Although that program still is on the books, it really has not been usable since the early 1990s for two reasons. One is it became too expensive, just the way in which the supports were operated became too expensive for the public sector. And also related to that is it largely became infeasible when we opened the doors to U.S. markets with the Uruguay round conclusion of what was then referred to as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That door is open enough now that if we tried to support the price of milk in the U.S., we'd end up supporting the price of milk in the entire world, which obviously is impossible for a single country to do. In the 1990s, we struggled with what can we do. We didn't really have much of a program in place. We started to see volatility arise. And in those low points of that cycle, that got pretty uncomfortable. And we shifted to a mechanism that's generally known in the policy world as an income subsidy. And basically, when you're in that world, you're saying, I can't fix the price. There's going to be times when prices are tough. But what can I do to make those prices, those low milk prices, more tolerable, easier to endure? And the milk income loss contract was dairy's first foray into the income subsidy world. You establish a price trigger. You say when the prices go below this trigger, we generate some payments. We didn't have a lot of budget for those payments, so we decided to restrict them by volume. And that meant if you were a small enough farm, you could qualify for any payments that might be triggered throughout the course of the year. But if you were a very, very large farm, you might be able to only cover a week or a couple weeks worth of milk production, and of course, every shade of gray in between. You didn't have to pay anything for that program. You just signed up, and if you qualified for a payment, they sent you a check. In the early days, I think most folks would say that program was reasonably successful, but a couple things came to the forefront. One, when the price of feed started to skyrocket as we got involved with ethanol and corn and raising the prices of the whole complex of grains, that old price program didn't do a good job of compensating for high feed costs. You could have a pretty high price for milk and not trigger it based on a price, but not actually be making too much money because your feed costs were so high. And the other thing that started to become more and more problematic is larger scale farms, and you didn't have to be a mega farm, but just larger scale farms felt like, hey, they could use some help too. They have to pay the feed bill just like anybody else. And MILC really wasn't able to provide those folks much assistance. Because of that, as we were getting ready for the next farm bill, which ultimately became the 2014 Farm Bill, we developed a new program, which was MPP Dairy. The MPP Dairy program was intended to be available for any size farm and was intended to do a much more sophisticated job of reflecting not only the price of milk, but the cost of feed. I think the designers of the program were just as disappointed as anyone that the execution and implementation of MPP Dairy proved to not be quite as effective as they hoped. And I would say, in fairness to them, this really wasn't so much because the program was poorly designed, but the fact of the matter is the government simply did not have a lot of money to allocate towards MPP Dairy. And so various different nips and tucks and choices were made to try to reduce the expected cost of the program. And ultimately, that ended up making the program fairly ineffective and in many ways, I think, disappointing producers who thought that they should have qualified for payments, but in fact did not receive them. This led to a couple of changes and proposals for changes that we now see in what we call, or what I'm calling, MPP Dairy 2.0. The basic design of MPP Dairy, I think, is based in the world of income subsidies, but it has features like an insurance program. You pay premiums, and you can pay a higher premium to get a higher level of benefit. The 2.0 builds on this framework, but tries to address a couple of the problems. One is we discovered as the program MPP Dairy originally rolled out that it was pretty good at collecting premiums, but not so good at paying out benefits. And it raised questions about, is the formula quite right? And there's some indication that maybe there were some non-feed costs that were rising that the program didn't reflect, that we didn't really anticipate, and that this led to lower profitability than just would be indicated by the feed costs. The other thing that I think we discovered is that this program was really designed for sort of catastrophic events, what I sometimes call the hard punch or the deep cut, that if you had a pretty extreme event, the program would come in and give you a little bit of restitution. What it wasn't really designed to do, and what we didn't really anticipate, is what I call a long scrape, where you have an extended period of time where returns don't really actually go that low, at least by historical measures, but they last for so long that they just simply become intolerable because there's no apparent relief in sight. 2.0 isn't going to help so much with that fundamental design as it is going to help with making the program a good deal more affordable, especially for farms that are about average size or smaller. It's also important to appreciate that 2.0 was only possible because it was written by a committee that deals with money, not by the committee that deals with programs. So the typical Agriculture Committee discussion of Farm Bill, which created 1.0, is a program committee, and they can suggest programs, but they have to work within the budget they're given. The Budget Committee has the ability to affect those numbers. Normally, the Budget Committee doesn't get into a lot of detail on program design, but they can from time to time. And in this case, Senator Leahy was very influential, was responsible for coming up with a couple of changes that involved money, which he was able to help push through on his committee. One of them was to take the cap off of LGM dairy and other livestock insurance products to make them more available at a subsidized premium throughout the course of the year, but also to create some changes in MPP dairy that were going to be more expensive, but would allow it to be more successful as a program to be used by farmers. LGM dairy and MPP dairy remain available for all farmers, but as was true from the beginning of the passage of MPP dairy, farmers can't, so to speak, double dip. You can use LGM dairy, but you cannot use MPP dairy until you've terminated all of your LGM dairy contracts. You can use futures markets, you can use options, you can forward contract with your co-op. Those are all private hedging tools. But because LGM dairy is also a government-sponsored program, USDA continues to not allow you to use both. And you do have to conclude your LGM dairy contract before you could activate an MPP contract. Although these two programs are somewhat similar in that they both deal with income over feed costs and involve differential pricing related to coverage, they do have a fundamental difference in design. The coverage amounts, $4 to $8, are fixed in stone for MPP dairy. The premiums are fixed in stone. They're the same if the expected year is a good year or a bad year. LGM dairy, on the other hand, allows different coverage levels. In fact, will result in different coverage levels depending on expected prices. Premiums will vary with every month that you sign up, and your ability to obtain a certain coverage level is defined or constrained by what the expected prices are. As a general rule, MPP dairy will probably be very attractive when expected margins are low, and LGM dairy will be more attractive when expected margins are high. You might say, well, if expected margins are high, why would I want to have any kind of program? And that relates to certainty. You may have expected margins that are above $8, but you might still want to be able to so-called lock in a return that LGM dairy will do, in which case maybe you can lock in a return that's at $10 or $12, which would be out of bounds for what MPP offers. What happens next? Well, that's always a good question, but a couple things we know. Basically, we get a do-over on MPP dairy sign-up. Mark is going to go through the specifics of that. Keep in mind, MPP Dairy 2.0 only amends the existing program. There's a lot of features of the original MPP Dairy that aren't changed. Production base and all of that sort of thing continues as it was before. It does change a couple of particular features that we think will make the program more appealing for producers. This program only lasts until this year, 2018. The Agricultural Act of 2014 expires on the 30th of September. The MPP dairy program goes all the way through to the end of December, so that's not an issue. But come next year, if we don't have anything new in place, we don't have any dairy policy. In fact, if we don't have anything in place, what we're going to go back to is the Agricultural Act of 1949, which means a price support program and $30, $35 milk prices, which we sometimes call the dairy cliff. Legislators on the House and the Senate are actively working to come up with a farm bill. There's not too much optimism that they'll have time to do things yet this spring. Then the election comes in November, and people usually aren't too keen on passing new laws right before an election. And so it's pretty easy to see this can getting kicked down the road until we come up to that dairy cliff. We'll see, but that wouldn't be too hard of a bet to make at this point. Again, remember that unless it was explicitly changed, all of the rules of the old MPP dairy program are still in place. If you've not enrolled in MPP before, you're going to have to go back to your production history of 2012, 13, or 14. If you began production after 2014, just as was true before, you can establish a base based on that first year of your new startup. Although the margin formula isn't changed, it is applied monthly. That will make a little difference in your ability to get a benefit in any particular month. There is conversation going on about having some kind of MPP Dairy 3.0 in the next Farm Bill. We'll see. That's a conversation we'll know more about as the months of 2018 progress. My personal feeling is that 2.0 is kind of going to be a little hard to change. It probably reflects the program that we'll have in the future, but we'll see. We know for sure it will go through 2018, and what happens in 2019 remains to be a story not yet written. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark, and he'll be explaining in more detail the program and the decision tool.
Well, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what these real changes are this time. What did Congress change in that Bipartisan Budget Act? There were three things that were changed primarily, and the first of them is that the volume that is allowed in the Tier 1, the so-called Tier 1, the lower level of premium, was increased from 4 million pounds of annual coverage to 5 million pounds. So they've allowed more milk to be coming in at that lower cost of premium under Tier 1. The other thing, as Andy mentioned, is that the indemnity calculations are no longer based on a 2-month average value, but they will be calculated monthly. And that does a couple of things. First of all, I guess it potentially gets the payments back to you more quickly, since we don't have to wait for that extra month. But the other thing is that, quite frankly, we could have a month when it would have triggered a payment, coupled or paired with a month when it wouldn't have triggered a payment, and the average of those two might not trigger a payment. But you would now get a monthly payment if one of those months did have that indemnity triggered. So it makes it a bit more sensitive in that respect. Not a big change to the bottom line, but some change. And the final thing that was changed in the Budget Act was that the cost of the Tier 1 premiums were greatly reduced. This table is showing you the basic structure of what the old premium was for less than 4 million pounds and what the new premium is for less than 5 million pounds. And you can see that there's no cost at all for coverage up to a $5 level now. Before, we considered $4 to be catastrophic, but now $5 incurs no premium. And all the way up to the $8 level of coverage for Tier 1, it now only costs 14.2 cents per hundredweight instead of 47.5 cents. So the reduction is substantial. There's no change at all in the Tier 2 premiums, the milk over 5 million pounds. And just for comparison purposes, look there and compare at the $8 level. The coverage now is $1.36 as it was before, compared to the 14 cents. So there's a tremendous difference in premium cost at these different levels. So there really was a big reduction. There are a few implementation rules as well. These are things that Congress or the Budget Committee didn't change, but actually that FSA has had to put into place. And so there are a handful of producers who did buy up coverage more than the catastrophic level in for 2018 coverage. And those people will be refunded their premium payments and allowed to re-enroll at a different level. So in other words, if you paid money already for the program this year, you'll get that back. You'll be able to use that to make a different decision, and you can buy up at a higher level if you want to now. And I think a lot of people may want to do that. There were also producers who were allowed, or any producer was allowed to drop MPP coverage this last year, and we had a lot of people that did that. The original act, the 2014 Farm Bill, said that once a producer is signed up, you were signed up for MPP for the life of the Farm Bill. And last year, because of general dissatisfaction with MPP, we had the Secretary of Agriculture that made the decision that producers could get out of their MPP coverage or contracts if they wanted to and go back to using LGM. However, you are still going to be ineligible if you have active LGM coverage this year. So the coverage is, if you had an LGM contract for January through March, you can't get January through March MPP coverage, but you can get coverage for April on through the rest of the year. Your premiums for MPP coverage are only going to be based on the number of months that you have MPP coverage for. So you wouldn't be charged for 12 months of coverage if you were only covering, say, 8 months of MPP dairy. So that's part of the implementation rules. And there was also a footnote in there that said that underprivileged farms can have the $100 basic fee waived as well. And those are farms that may be eligible for service loans or a variety of other things. It's spelled out at the FSA office, but those may be able to have that $100 fee waived. Couple of other things. The MPP coverage this year is retroactive, and so it'll allow you to cover all of the months in 2018, including the months that we already know so far. January and February, we know exactly what the MPP payments are going to be, but January and February will in fact be covered when you sign up this year. The new MPP sign up is from today, April 9th, on through June 1st, very generous. By June 1st, we will know all the MPP margins from January through April with certainty. And so it makes it pretty easy this year about whether or not this is a reasonable thing for you to do. LGM coverage might complicate that a little bit, but nevertheless, you will know quite well. And you can still elect the percentage of what you're covering of your historic production between 25 and 90%. I will just make a quick note. It's clear that the $8 level of coverage is a really inexpensive opportunity for dairy farms at tier 1 levels of coverage, 14.2 cents. But if you elect for an $8 coverage in tier 1, you also are electing for $8 coverage in tier 2, any milk that would be in that level of or spill over on into tier 2 coverage. So you have to think a little bit about whether or not it makes sense for you if you have more than 5 million pounds of milk that would be covered. The bottom line on that is just that you can't sign up for $8 coverage on tier 1 and $4 coverage on tier 2. So just to look ahead a little bit, this graph on the right here is showing you what we're forecasting the margins to be in these upcoming months. And you can see that we are expecting coverage. We know we have payments, for example, for February that will be made. And also we're forecasting them for March, April, May, June, July, and a very tiny one right now for August. Beyond that, not coverage levels, but we are forecasting right now that we would be expecting payments for at least half of the year. And if you take a look at the expected benefits, one way to do that is to look at the different coverage levels. This is for a farm that produces 1 million pounds of milk and would select maybe 90% coverage of their historic production, or 900,000 pounds of milk. And you can see that the participation costs up there, the $100 premium plus, or the $100 fee plus the premium at the $8 level would be about $1,378. We would expect right now anticipated payments of about $5,000, or a net benefit to this relatively small farm of $3,600. Positive net benefit, small for $7, but $7.50 and $8, clearly it's a positive net benefit. One other way to look at this is just looking at the probabilities, and I'll show you that our main decision tool does give you an idea about how likely are these outcomes. We can calculate what we think those probabilities are, and this is a graph that's showing you the probability of net benefit. That's the difference between what we think you'll be paid and what the cost of the premium are, or premiums are at the different coverage levels, 8, 7, 57, and so forth. It's positive, you know, for a long way down there, but clearly from $7 to $8 is pretty high probability in tier 1 and a very low probability in tier 2 of a net benefit. So I want to take a look and say, suppose you do have an LGM contract out here. How do I think about this? Because what I've just shown you is that if you can cover the whole year, it's pretty clear that I think you'd want to participate in MPP dairy. But if you have LGM, then it starts to be a little bit more complicated. And I don't know if you may have the full year's worth of coverage, but I'm going to say this is the expected indemnity payments on a per hundredweight basis at these different levels in different months here coming up. And the last month that we expect indemnity payments might be in August, and we're expecting about a 15-cent indemnity then. So let's start with the back end of the month and work forward. If we're looking at August with the last payment in there, you've been paying now for the months of August, September, October, and November and December. Those would be the months where you'd be paying a premium, and you would only receive that 15-cent payment for the 1 month. That's equal to about 3 cents per hundredweight out of the 14.2 cents that you would have covered for the premium. If in fact your LGM contract is over by June and you could cover July and August, you would now have 1 more month's worth of premium to pay, but you'd also have a much larger expected indemnity for that month of July. And with those 2 months, you'd be covering about 12.5 cents of that 14.2 cent premium at the $8 coverage level. So still not enough to make it worthwhile at this point in time. These things may change as time goes forward. What about if your LGM contracts would end in May and you've now got June, July, and August with indemnities? Here you can say, yes, this is a time to start, because we would expect to have 25 cents worth of indemnity over all that milk that's covered, and we're only paying 14.2 cents, so it's a positive net benefit. So again, think about your LGM conflict months as if you have at least from May onward, you're in good shape, and you'd want to think about signing up for MPP as soon as you could. Suppose you have a production history that's over 5 million pounds, because there's a big difference in the cost of those premiums. As you get as close to 5 million pounds covered as you can. I guess that's the bottom line on here. So for example, if your production history is 12.5 million pounds, you can choose to cover only 40% of that production history. That gets you down to the 5 million pounds covered, and that would maximize your payment. If your production history is above 20 million pounds, then you'll be buying some tier 2 coverage. You can't avoid it. If you go all the way down to 25% coverage on that 20 million pounds, it means that you're going to be covering 6.25 million pounds of milk. And if you choose the $8 level, 5 million pounds of that would be at that low 14.2 cent cost of premium, but the other 1.25 million would be at the $1.36 level. So the net benefit there is still positive, $10,000 or 17 cents per hundredweight on your covered milk. You can continue to play with this kind of concept, but you realize that you run out of headspace if you've got about 31, 32 million pounds of milk production history. So that's something like 1,200 cows. If you're above that level, then it's not going to pay you to be looking at MPP dairy this year, in my opinion, as we're looking forward. Now, we have updated the decision tool. I'm waiting for a green light from FSA before we make that live. We have the old tool still up and going, but this is what the new tool looks like. This is the front page on here that gives you a little idea about what's been changed and the disclaimer at the bottom that you have to go through. When you do get into that, however, you'll see a screen that looks pretty similar, and this screen however, is now covering the entire year of January through December rather than scrolling forward every month because our decision period goes up to June 1st for sign up, and we're going to have to show you not only what we forecast but what's also been the case, and we've changed that so you can do that now. And here you'll see that we are anticipating these payments for coverage that would be at the $8 level or even below $7 in some months. The forecasting also has this probability table that you can look at, just another way to look at the months at a time. In the past, this was in 2-month pairs. Now it's at individual months. And if you're now ready to select coverage, you can go and click the select coverage button right here. And when you do that, it pops up the screen that says, did you participate and did you pay the timely fee? If you did, then it tells you what your production history is going to be, because we do get a little bump every year from the increase in national production. And you'll notice up here in the upper right-hand corner, your annual production history is reduced by the level of coverage, the 90% level that we have here. And this is showing you down here what we expect the net returns to be and the expected payments to be. You can change this on the tool quite easily. So if we did go ahead and change this to say 5.2 million pounds of production history, it now makes this just about 5 million pounds, and the expected net returns are quite a bit higher. The demo that's going to be available that we have of the decision tool, not the demo, but the live decision tool are accessible at 2 locations. One of them is our dairymarkets.org website, and there you go to the MPP and the tool, or you can go to the somewhat longer URL at the FSA website, but exactly the same tool will be up and available at both of those sites. So either through FSA or through the dairymarkets.org website. I'm going to take you over right now just to a live demonstration. This is actually in the browser right now, and this is the screen that comes up. You have to click the I agree button, but once you have done that, it pops up this forecast graph. Let me make that a little bigger for you to see. And again, we see our forecasts for any given month. February is known, as is January with certainty. But with March, we have expectations that they're going to be quite a bit lower margins than we had in February. The bands around here, the green and red bands, are showing you a 50% probability range, 25% below the black line, 25% above it. And I should also say there is some 25% that it could be even higher than this, or 25% that it would be even lower. But this is just trying to give you an idea about how uncertain are we about these future. Nearby, we're fairly certain. As we get farther out, we're less certain. So there's that. If you click the button right here, you will see the probability table. So this is the probability that we would have a payment below $8. And we're completely sure about January and February. In March, we're as close to 100% as we can be. And you'll notice that we don't even get down here to some percent confidence below that until you get to 650 coverage level. Just another way to look at it. If we go over to the select coverage area, again, these question marks pop up. We can say yes or no. And it tells us something about how much our history has been increased because of changes in milk production in the US. But this now is showing us what our administrative fees and premiums would be at the different levels of coverage, what the expected payments are likely to be, and what the net returns would be, which is the difference between these payments and the administrative fees. You'll notice up here is my historic milk production. I can actually change that, and I'm going to just do it by looking at maybe saying 3,500,000. And when I do, you can see that the table is changed down here now as well. My fees and premiums have gone up, and my expected returns have changed as well. This is a good way to play around with some things. So for example, I mentioned that if you are at a level of like 30 million pounds, we now look at this and would say, yeah, boy, the expected payments are not going to be bigger than our premiums are going to be. So, you know, for a large farm, it probably doesn't make too much sense for you. But if you're in the smaller range, a farm like maybe 20 million pounds of milk, this will change as well. And it did, I think. Did it? Okay. Yes, it did change. But the expected payment, oh, I didn't change the coverage level. No wonder. Thank you. So here I changed the amount of my milk that I'm covering. And at this level, 10 million pounds of production, I'm only covering 2.8 million pounds. I could bump that up rather considerably to maybe 20 million. And at the 25% level, I still get positive expected benefits. At the 30 million pound level, not so much. We are looking at a barely break even here. So with that, I think maybe Heather or Chris, what we should do is to go to some questions that people might have.
Sure, Mark. Thanks. This is Tom, actually. But yeah, great presentation. Great with the live demo. So that's excellent. Later in the year, if you've got LGM contracts, can you sign up for NPP to begin after your LGM contracts end? So let's say you had contracts through September on LGM. Could up to until the June sign up date, could you sign up for coverage, you know, starting in October and under MPP? And that's a different question as to whether you would want to, based on the projected margins, but could you?
The easy answer is yes, you can.
Yes.
So as soon as your LGM contracts are ended, you're eligible to sign up for MPP dairy. If your contracts ended in September, as you indicated, then you could sign up for coverage in October, November, December of the year. And again, I think it's important to note the distinction from just exactly what you said, can I and should I? Can I? Yes. Right now, should I think is questionable because we aren't expecting payments in that latter part of the year. But I will also point out that if you're thinking about this as risk management and you know, some level of protection or safety, 14 cents at the $8 level is a very inexpensive option for some level of risk protection.
Okay. We had another question coming from a milk producer who said that they operate 2 farms, but there are 2 separate milk producer licenses. And the question was whether or not those get treated as one or if they get treated separately.
That is a little bit of a question for the FSA implementation. I think in the state, we have at least had some evidence in the past that they've been treated a little bit differently. If you have 2 farms that are, you know, a half mile from each other. They may be and operated basically as a single entity. In some states, the FSA office has said they are a single entity, but for the most part, if you operate two farms in different counties or different regions, they are treated as separate entities and can have separate decisions made on each of those.
Great. Question came in. Maybe you could just review production history. Someone asked how they find out what their production history is.
Okay, if you have an operating farm back in 2012, 13, or 14, any of those 3 years, your production history is going to be the highest level of production that you attained in one of those 3 years. So that's what we typically have for most people who have not been enrolled in MPP before. If you were already enrolled in MPP and dropped out of it this last December, then you already have a production history and you probably know what it is. If you are a new facility, a new barn, an operation that has never established a production history, then you can still do that even if the farm didn't exist in 2012, 13, or 14. And that's going to be based on a couple of different criteria. I would say you just need to contact your FSA office and they will establish that for you. But it's based on the average number of cows that you had in that year, and the average milk production per cow is the typical way that it's been done. Or if you have production for a part of a current year, then they may forecast that forward.
And keep in mind, as if you're brand new to the program, or maybe you just forgot and want to check, when you go to FSA, the form that you use to establish your production history is different than the form you use to make a selection under MPP Dairy. You can go into that office any day you want and get your production history established without making any commitment to participating in the program. And so if you haven't done that already, it's easy to do, and you can get that settled long before you actually have to make an enrollment decision.
Okay. And I think that ties into another question where someone asked, what if you did not participate back in 2017? Am I hearing right that it really doesn't matter if you participated in the past or not, that you can still sign up?
You can, but I think if you were a person who had participated prior to last year but decided to drop the MPP enrollment when you had the opportunity, it's going to be an easy thing to just re-enroll this year. Your paperwork will already be in there. They'll have that from last time, and I think the re-enrollment will be pretty straightforward.
And I think, Mark, you'll have your old production history from the last time you were enrolled.
That's right.
Okay. Someone asked about the fact that in MPP 1.0, as you guys were calling it, that there was a 10% holdback. Now, I think what the question may be asking about is the fact that you can only go up to 90% coverage, which is obviously those coverage levels have continued the same between 1.0 and 2.0, or was there some other 10% kind of holdback in the old program?
Well, possibly what the gentleman or person is thinking about is the sequestration reduction in payments. That's a good question. I believe that those kind of across the board government reductions have been suspended by virtue of this Budget Act. So if that's the particular nature of this question, then I think what you see is what you get. There won't be any rake off for general budget relief. And as you say, the 25 to 90% of your production history continues to be the rule in terms of the amount of milk you can cover.
Great. Someone asked, though, when the new tool will be rolled out. I mean, it is, Mark, you were just doing a live demonstration on the site, correct?
That's correct. I'm only waiting for a blessing from FSA to say that we can do that. As soon as we do, we'll publish that. I'm hopeful that maybe this afternoon yet it will be made available. So it's ready to go.
Yeah, of course,
Okay,
keep in mind,
so it's not live yet.
you can
Okay.
register tomorrow, but they won't start concluding it till June 1st. So we got quite a bit of time.
Right, right. No, they were asking about the availability of the decision tool. So that's good to know that that'll be coming online here shortly. Someone asked about a question which probably be a good one to review. They were asking about the price upon which the margin's calculated, and they were asking if it was related to a regional price. But I know that's a national price. Maybe you guys could just review that quickly.
It is a national set of values, and it's meant to not be your margin at your farm necessarily. This is hopefully a reasonable barometer of when things are good or not good on a farm. And it uses the U.S. All milk price, and it uses the average price received for corn from the NASS monthly survey, the average price received for alfalfa hay from the NASS survey, and it uses the Decatur, Illinois value for soybean meal. Those are values that we always have with a little over a 1 month lag. So for example, toward the end of the month, usually around the 25th, 6th, 7th, something like that, Agricultural Prices is the name of the bulletin that contains most of that information, and it will be published looking back at the previous month. So not too long ago, on the 27th, I think, of the past month in March, we had the February values, and that allowed us to look at the February margins. And as we get toward the, I forgot, 26th, 27th of this month, Ag Prices comes out again, and we will know on that day what the margins are for March.
A couple things I would add. One is the reason why we use the kind of apparently funny soybean meal price is because there isn't a national price for soybean meal collected by the National Ag Statistics Service. So we went to the next best available indicator for that. The other thing that I think is always important to say when people are thinking about how does this match up with my margin, Mark likes to say it isn't really necessary that when the national number is $7, that your number is $7. What's really important is if the national number goes down $1, that your experience goes down similarly. In other words, are you getting a payment when you need a payment? And so that's in the world of basis. And so no, it doesn't reflect regional values, but the question that appropriately you would ask yourself is, does this number go up and down more or less in alignment with what my real number goes up and down?
All right, great. We have a couple of questions that are in the realm of timing. And so two of them are kind of related in the sense, someone asked if they asked, well, geez, if the sign up is open till June 1st, and as Mark pointed out that you'll know all the way through April, is there any benefit of signing up before then? But then someone else asked if they sign up right away, would they get, say, for example, the February payment sooner?
Okay, those are both good questions. There's no particular benefit to going in and signing up right away, except I think that FSA office would probably tell you, please don't all come in on, May 30th. We can't handle a big slug of folks. So, if you're going in there to report planted acreage or something else into your FSA office, I think it's a good time to go ahead and do the paperwork and sign up while you're in the office anyway. So go ahead and do it ahead of time. I have asked the very question that was asked about if you signed up earlier, will you get early payments sooner? And I believe that the answer to that is yes. So if you signed up right away, you might get the February payment pretty quickly. And as soon as the April indemnity is triggered, then you would get the April payment or the March payment. So signing up earlier may help you get some cash flowing a little bit more quickly.
Mark, you say that you sound like you're not 100% sure that they will process payments as soon as you've completed your enrollment.
I asked the question explicitly, and I got a question that, or an answer that sounded like, yes, we're going to process those sooner. But, you know, I felt like they were waffling a little too, so that's why I was.
Good thing to check in your local FSA office. It's a big program and a big agency with, you know, all kinds of offices out there, and sometimes it's hard to get the correct information out to everybody. So cut your FSA office a little bit of slack, but certainly if you can get a payment earlier, check with your FSA office, and obviously that would be very desirable.
Great. So Andy, Mark, we're coming up to the end of our hour. We still have a bunch more questions. If you two can stay on, I would keep asking them, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And I'll just kind of take a pause here for folks who do have a hard stop at 2. We want to thank you for joining us. As was mentioned earlier, we are going to be recording the webinar. So if you do have to leave the webinar at this point, you're interested in some of the other questions that are coming in, obviously check back at farmcrediteast.com/webinars for the full recording. So getting back to the questions, back in the timing realm, someone asked about if they have LGM contracts that start for July through the end of the year, can they sign up for MPP for the months prior to that?
No, the answer is no. I also asked that question explicitly too. You know, what the law states is that you can't have both programs going at the same time, but the interpretation of FSA is that you can't be enrolled in MPP until your LGM contracts are done. So, you know, for example, if you have active LGM contracts for the last quarter of the year and would like to get the first half of, you know, 2018 with MPP, you're not going to be able to do that. So those things are mutually exclusive, but in point of fact, you can't start MPP until LGM is done.
And there's no way to get out of an LGM contract.
Not that I'm aware of.
So someone asked about one of the changes was that the catastrophic coverage, as it were, is been raised from $4 to $5. And is that only for production of the tier 1, or is that tier 2 as well?
Well, you know, there's a little terminology I think involved here. There's no premium until you get above that $5.50 level. You know, the premium is actually 0, but I think that they're still considering catastrophic coverage to be $4. So for example, if you don't go in and make an election about buy-up in a time period, we have a default that you fall back to catastrophic coverage, right? If you're enrolled but haven't paid a premium, you go back to catastrophic coverage. Even if you only produce, say, 2 million pounds of milk, I don't think it falls back to $5.50. I think it goes all the way back to $4. So catastrophic coverage is considered to be the $4 level.
Yeah, remember what the bill did was just change the premium rates. And unless it explicitly made some other change, MPP Dairy 1.0 rules are still into effect. So my understanding is that you pay your $100, you get $4 coverage on 90% of your production history. When you do the buy-up, you can change that production coverage to 85 or 35 or whatever number in between 25 and 90, and that will apply to the 5 and 550 level, even though there's no price.
Okay, good. Someone asked, while we're on the subject of premiums, someone asked, are all the premiums due at sign up, or is there any installment option there?
Nope, they aren't due at sign up. I think that, if I remember correctly, the final date is in September 30th, that they have to be paid by. So the interesting thing about this year is that, you know, for people who are covering 5 million pounds or less, you're you're not actually going to physically be writing a check at all, because they will deduct the premium from the payments that you should be receiving, and that will all be taken care of well before you get to the end of the year.
Okay, so someone asked a question that if they signed up now, but let's say in the next few months they go out of business, but they were in business when they, you know, sort of retroactively, would they be able to get, say the February or March payments?
Yeah, this
Maybe
is
that's a
falling
question
into
for
a gray
FSA
area.
or. Right. And obviously, we're asking you guys as subject matter experts. Obviously, people got to go to their FSA office to kind of, you know, make it official, if you will. But I know, so I don't want to put you on the spot too much.
Well, the curious thing is that the ability to participate in MPP and the level that you can cover is based on your production history. It's not based on how much milk you're actually producing today. However, you do have to be an active producer. So if you decided to sell all but one cow and you still had one cow that you were milking, you can cover the milk that you would have had from 500 cows or whatever it was before your production history. But if you don't have any milk anymore, you're not an active producer, you're obliged to let Farm Service Agency know that you are no longer an active producer.
Yeah, there might be a little caveat there that, you know, if you're just keeping this pet cow and milking it, that might be one thing, but I think you might have to actually be marketing milk.
Well, I think that's right. I was using that as an extreme example.
Yeah, yeah. So sell the milk to your neighbor and be sure you get receipts. But actually, really, the serious answer is double check with FSA to be sure about all of these things, because they're the ones that are going to have the authority to give you the full and correct answer.
Right, understood. And actually, we did get someone, an FSA staff person who's on the webinar, clarified when we were talking before about signing up after LGM contracts expired. They clarified that everyone, if you are going to sign up for MPP, it does have to be by the June 1st deadline. So thanks for that clarification there. So someone pointed out, Andy, this in terms of your retrospective on dairy policies, not mentioning the dairy compact, which I thought was interesting. Another, obviously, Senator Leahy was, you know, the primary force behind that, which I think sort of really was kind of the inspiration for MILC once that was in there. So I thought an interesting note. Someone asked about the consideration for regional feed costs, and I think this gets back to Mark's comment or about that it's, you know, obviously it's a national index that's being used, but do you know if that is the Farm Bill gets underway and there are tweaks done to the program, if that's going to be under consideration?
Not seriously. I mean, this certainly has come up. The folks that are on the House and Senate Ag Committee certainly are aware of that point of view. But I think there are two things that come into play, for good or ill. One is there's kind of this feeling of this is a national program, we're going to use national numbers. You can debate whether or not that's a real sensible argument, but I think that's part of it. But I think there's also a feeling that if you're going to change the calculation of feed costs to some regional thing, then you also have to change the triggers. So if we want to say, well, $8 is an average for the country, just to say that as a starting point, if you change the feed costs and you say, well, we pay more for feed in California, we have higher feed costs because we use more feed, then you don't get $8, you're going to get $10 because that's what the average is for California. And if it's Wisconsin says, well, you know, our average feed cost is more like $6, then you know, you got to calibrate the trigger down to $6. And if you do that, then it sort of feels like, well, it doesn't make that much difference. Again, you can debate whether or not any of that makes sense, but I think this is a perspective that exists in the Congress and among the people designing these programs, that if you make all those adjustments consistently, it doesn't really end up changing the program. And to go back to Mark's statement, the real question isn't whether or not your average is 8. The real question is when the program says you need money, that in fact you do need money. And when the program says you don't need money, you in fact don't need money. And so does it go up and down together, as opposed to is it exactly the same at any moment in time?
Okay, great. And so I think we're just going to hit a couple more questions here. And again, I want to thank you both for the information here today. One of the questions is about kind of that production history. Someone asked it, what would happen if you say had a large herd reduction size, say in one of those kind of baseline years? Does that, kind of how does that get factored in terms of making any adjustment to your production history?
Well, the decision is that you take the highest year of those three. So if you had the highest years being 2012, and then you had a herd reduction, a significant one in 2013 or 14, doesn't matter. 2012 becomes that high water mark for you. So that is basically the way the production history was determined.
Okay. All right, great. So I think we're going to end up with this last question here. So if someone with say a 10 million pound base signs up for basically 50% coverage, so 5 million pounds, so would they pay just the tier 1 price on the 5 million pounds?
That's correct. Your premiums are going to be based on the first 5 million pounds of milk that you cover in tier 1. If you had to cover more than 5 million pounds, then however much spills over into that above 5 million pounds gets covered at the tier 2 level, but your first 5 million pounds are still at the tier 1. That's true for everybody.
Okay, great. And so a kind of a corollary to that question was someone with 24 million pounds, they could get the lowest coverage level is 25%. So they could get the 5 million at the tier 1 level, but they would have to then do 1 million at the tier 2. And I know you were showing us, Mark, an example on there where, the decision tool will help you kind of decide whether or not, at least based on projection margins, it makes sense to cover that additional amount at the tier 2 level.
Yeah, indeed. And kind of another way to think about it is at $8 coverage, you're gonna lose money on that tier 2 milk. But if the tier 2 milk is small enough, the average payment can still be positive.
Yep.
Right.
And that decision tool will help you think that through pretty easily.
Okay, great.
When do they expect the tool to go live?
Yeah, so when, and Mark, you said you hopefully today or tomorrow that the revised tool will be going live once you get the approval?
That's correct. It's done, it's ready to go. So we're expecting to get that online very shortly. It won't take much to flip the switch.
Great. Okay, great. Well, again, just want to thank you both for the information and for helping producers figure out what's going to work best for them. And want to thank all the participants for joining in, asking a lot of great questions. As you can see on your screen, that these webinars are recorded, so you can go back to farmcredit.com/webinars. But one of our upcoming webinars may be of interest to a number of folks on the phone as well, where we're going to release the results of our annual Northeast Dairy Farm Summary. And so that webinar is going to be held on Tuesday, May 1st at 11 a.m. So you can go and sign up for that as well. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us and hope everyone out there has a great day. Thanks.